Welcome, everybody. I'm John Hinderaker, and I'm joined today by Bill Glahn. People are still joining the Zoom. There's a lot of people on today's webinar, and they're still coming in. It always takes a little bit when you have a lot of people making connections. So I'll start just by mentioning that we are going to do some Q&A today. Bill is going to talk about this latest Feeding Our Future trial. And then we'll take questions from our viewers. So if you have a question, if you hover over the bar at the bottom of your Zoom screen, there's a tab that says Q&A, and if you click on that, you can type a question. And when we get done with the presentation, we'll take as many of your questions as we have time for. So with that preface, Bill, thanks for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
Bill, you have probably followed the Feeding Our Future scandal longer and in more depth than anybody else in the state of Minnesota. And this second trial, which has just been concluded a couple of days ago, is being described by everybody really as the big one. This is the big Feeding Our Future trial. Why is that?
Well, because it has defendant number one in the case. So people will recall there's been several waves of indictments in the case, and we're up to 70 defendants overall. But the very first indictment and the very first name that appears on that indictment is Aimee Bock. She's the CEO and founder of the now infamous nonprofit Feeding Our Future. So she has always been at the center of this scandal. And you said you've been following it for a while, more than 3 years, John. This all started in January 2020 when the FBI led a task force of 200 federal agents. They weren't all FBI, some IRS inspectors, Postal Service inspectors, 200 federal agents descended on a couple of dozen locations in the greater Twin Cities area in a very cold day back in January 2022. And it's taken us this long to get to the trial of the main character in the drama, and that's Aimee Bock.
Now, there's a second defendant in this trial, too, a guy named Said. Who is he, and why is he paired with Aimee Bock out of all these 70 defendants? Why is he the one that goes on trial with?
Well, originally it was supposed to be 4 in this group. There were originally 4 defendants who were assigned as co-defendants for this trial that just concluded. And Salim Said is defendant number 3. He was a co-owner of the Safari restaurant in South Minneapolis, who happened to be the biggest, or allegedly, the biggest food vendor for Feeding Our Future during this whole time period. So he was at the center of it in that he was part of the biggest contributor to the scandal, if you will, Safari restaurant. He was defendant number 3. Defendant number 2 was an employee of Feeding Our Future. He's actually an international fugitive from justice. He slipped the noose way back at the beginning of this thing, fled abroad, and we haven't heard from him since. But there were supposed to be 2 other business partners of Salim Said who were going to be on trial with the same group, but just at the last minute before the trial started in February, they pled guilty.
So this trial lasted for about 6 weeks, I think, right?
Correct. 6 weeks this thing went on.
And it was prosecuted by, I think the same team from the U.S. Attorney's Office that's been on this case for a long time, led by Assistant U.S. Attorney Joe Thompson, but also assisted in court by, I think, several others.
Right. So Joe Thompson, Assistant U.S. Attorney, he's been the lead prosecutor for all of the Feeding Our Future related cases. He was the lead prosecutor for the first trial, which occurred last spring. The lead prosecutor for this trial, assisted ably by several other assistant U.S. attorneys who assisted in, say, the closing arguments, some of the cross-examination, direct examination. But Joe has been the lead and saw this thing through to the end.
And Joe Thompson is good. For those of our viewers who wonder whether the federal government can ever do anything right, Joe Thompson is a good lawyer, a good prosecutor, and has done a very able job in these cases.
And he is. And then the former U.S. attorney for the District of Minnesota is a man named Andy Luger, who you and I have both met. and he was an appointee of Joe Biden. He had an earlier term as U.S. Attorney in Minnesota under one of the the Barack Obama administrations, and he has been very aggressive in prosecuting this fraud. He did an exit interview right before he left office in January, saying that Minnesota has a fraud problem and being very upfront about it and what he's been doing in his office to confront it. Joe Thompson has done a great job. The FBI led the investigation of this. They did a great job. Their special agent. The person who really broke the case open was a forensic accountant on the payroll of the FBI. And she dug into the bank records and all the financial records and really got the goods on these and other defendants in the case. Postal inspectors, as I mentioned, IRS agents contributed. I know you and I both criticize the federal government, and I believe rightly so, for their actions and inactions. But here's a series of actions that the federal government has taken. They've executed well, and they've done us all proud.
One of the things that made this case so interesting, or this trial so interesting, is that contrary to the usual practice, these defendants, Aimee Bock and Salim Said, both testified.
Yeah, it was a little unusual. And again, my understanding, I could be wrong, but my understanding is both of the defendants who went to trial in this group, and I saw them, they both testified in their own defense, apparently against the advice of counsel. And having sat through it,
why would a lawyer say that? Why would a defense lawyer publicly say, "I advised my client not to testify"?
Right.
Doesn't that basically signal that the guy's guilty as sin, and you're trying to keep him off the stand lest he be destroyed?
The Aimee Bock's defense lawyer likes to talk to the press, so he comes over to the little press box and converses with the members of the local media. And the jury's not in the room when he's making these statements. And presumably they stuck to their charge of avoiding all media during those 6 weeks. So the jurors didn't hear the lawyer saying, "My client is testifying in opposition to my best advice." But the media did and printed it.
Yeah. So let's talk about the jury for a moment. As you know, I tried jury cases for over 40 years during my legal career. And in any trial, the most important people in the room are the jurors. What impression did you get of this jury?
Well, they were obviously taking it seriously. I could see them across the room. They seemed to be engaged with what the witnesses were saying. They're taking notes. They all had legal pads or notebooks. They were taking copious notes as the case. They seemed to be paying attention and very into it. But I do take something away from the fact it was a 6-week case, and the jury deliberated only 5 hours in reaching a verdict on 28 separate counts. So they had made up their mind, and they all seemed to be on the same page once they got into that deliberation room.
And the jurors seemed to get along well, and so forth. They all wore green on St. Patrick's Day.
St. Patrick's Day, not a holiday, but they all entered the courtroom all wearing green, not the same shade of green, but obviously they had discussed this among themselves the previous Friday, and they all came dressed in honor of the holiday. So they we have visual evidence that they bonded back in that jury room.
So Bill, in talking about the trial, why don't we start at the general level and then drill down and get more specific? Let me just ask to kind of kick us off here. What were your general impressions of the trial as you observed it?
Well, again, my general impression is I had sat through the first trial, and then now this is the second trial in this series. And it seemed to me, and maybe I'm being a little unfair to the prosecution team, in that perhaps they learned from their mistakes in the first trial, because listeners will remember in the first trial, 7 defendants. There were 7 defendants in total. That was lesson number 1, a smaller batch of defendants. And what had happened in the first trial, 7 defendants, and it seemed like a couple of them had slipped through the cracks and ended up being acquitted of all charges. So there were,
although one of them then got nailed for bribery.
Right. One of them was re-indicted in the bribery case and is now in custody awaiting trial on the bribery. But one got away completely. He was acquitted of the fraud charges, never charged in the bribery case, and he's a free man. But yes, they were very careful to go through charge by charge, tying all 28 charges to a piece of physical evidence in the case, and that piece of physical evidence tied whichever defendant was being charged with that charge. So they had a in closing statements, a 175-page PowerPoint. And I've been working PowerPoint for a couple of decades now. I've never done a 175-page slide deck.
So, but let's talk about the charges. What exactly were these people charged with?
Well, again, 28 total charges. Bach, 7 charges, Said, 21 charges. And they were all charged with variations on conspiracy and the underlying crimes of money laundering, federal programs bribery, and then the main charge, which is wire fraud.
So federal charges are kind of funny, because basically they stole a lot of money, but you got to fit that into into the federal criminal statutes. And so wire fraud winds up being kind of a catch-all in many cases. So what exactly is the wire fraud? What does that
in
mean?
this case, the wire, you remember the old gangster movies, is the phone, the telephone, or the old mail fraud, postal fraud. So this is emails. So they had a witness from Google who came and testified on the stand about how Gmail works and where the physical computer servers are located. And they're not in Minnesota, as it turns out.
Because it's got to be interstate.
Right. So every email that the prosecution used in support of a wire fraud charge, they could show its path where it might have originated in Minnesota or even in Minneapolis. It traveled out of state to its ultimate recipient, who might have only been a couple offices down from the person who sent it. But it was wire fraud in that message traveled across state lines and back again. And they used that medium in furtherance of a crime.
So those are the kind of technical federal charges. Let's just drill down a little bit into the facts and what these people actually did. The basic thing. So you had the sponsors, and there were at least 3 and maybe a couple of small sponsors who had organized sites, right? And so Feeding Our Future kind of went down in history as the biggest or one of the biggest sponsors of a whole bunch of different sites. Right.
So Andy Luger, the former U.S. attorney, described this as the largest single COVID-related fraud in the United States. And it involved the theft of $250 million. And you have these, collectively, they're called the Federal Child Nutrition Programs. There are 2 federal programs operated through the U.S. Department of Agriculture. But the local agent for USDA in Minnesota is the Department of Education, the State Department of Education, MDE, we usually refer to it as. So MDE, these child nutrition programs got their start, or at least were designed to be conducted through daycares, childcare settings, or after-school settings. And so that's how they kind of mesh with the child nutrition programs run by the State Department of Education, like the school lunch program. And so MDE is supposed to be overseeing this, and then they contract out with nonprofits, including Feeding Our Future and some others, who then act as the go-between between government and the people who run the local distribution sites where food is handed out or fed to children. And so for their cost and the services they provide as this go-between, the sponsor takes anywhere between 10 and 15% commission of all the money. So $250 million flowed through the Feeding Our Future nonprofit. They kept $25 million of that for their own uses. But Feeding Our Future was the nexus, the portal, the gatekeeper of the fraudsters who are working these individual sites. And it could be, again, a daycare, a restaurant, after-school program, city parks were pressed into service, you name it.
Or apartments,
individual apartments. Of course, these weren't real sites, so maybe none of them were.
So let's just, so we've talked about kind of the technical charges, but now just kind of the substance of what these people did. The sites, the fundamental thing that they did was to invoice Feeding Our Future for many millions of dollars, representing the cost of meals that they ostensibly supplied to poor children. When in fact they didn't. Either they didn't supply any meals at all, or more likely they supplied a few, but they billed for vastly more than they actually fed anybody. Is that the story with Safari?
That's the story with Safari, and the story with all the other sites sponsored by Said and his business partners. Oddly enough, perhaps to get even more money. I mentioned that Feeding Our Future were supplying services as a go-between, as an intermediary, taking that 10-15% commission. Apparently that wasn't enough. So Feeding Our Future started their own distribution sites, their own proprietary sites where they could keep 100% of whatever they billed for. And so there were several of those sites around, but at its heart, this case was about overbilling. So there's no doubt that some number of children were fed, some number of meals were distributed, and this works between the first case and the second case. There's about a 10-to-1 ratio. So for example, the restaurant or the daycare distributed 300 meals, they billed for 3,000. They distributed 1,000 meals. They billed for 10,000. That ratio for 10-to-1 held pretty consistent across these cases. So they overbilled. It wasn't that no children were fed. It was that nowhere near as many children were fed as the invoices sent to the State Department of Education indicated.
So Salim Said, the co-owner of the Safari restaurant group, did testify. What did he say? What was his defense?
His defense boiled down to 3 words. It wasn't me. So it was my business partners. And he tried to put a lot of blame on one of his business partners, one of his other co-owners in the restaurant, who served as the CFO for this whole enterprise. And it wasn't just the restaurant. There were a lot of other corporate entities that were created with varying levels of legitimacy. And this gentleman, in addition to being a co-owner of the restaurant itself, ran an accounting firm. And he did all the accounting for all the corporate entities involved. And Said tried to blame this man, whose name is Noor Said, or Noor, I'm going to mispronounce his name. He was supposed to have been the real criminal mastermind behind this.
It's kind
Noor
of
Salah. Finally, Noor Salah is his name. And again,
it's ironic though that it was Said who ran the accounting firm.
Well, it was interesting that he tried to say it wasn't me. I trusted my business partner, but there was, like I said, all this physical evidence. There was this huge enterprise, $200 million a year going through this nonprofit, and through some $32 million going through Safari Restaurant and the interlocking companies. They used paper checks. Everything was done by paper check. And so the prosecutors were able to show up on that the PowerPoint thing, the canceled checks, and they all had Salim Said's name on them, and he admitted that was his signature. And it's like, well, why did you send this check, which turns out to be a bribe or turned out to be money laundering? He said, well, my man told me to do it, and I trusted him. So that didn't play with the jury. He was found guilty on all accounts. But his basic argument was, I was very trusting. I was just an investor in these companies. I was a hands-off, absentee owner, if you will.
Now, they also put into evidence photographs, I believe, showing meals, stacked up on trays or something in the Safari.
The defense
restaurant.
did. So they hired a videographer who did testify on behalf of the defense. And the videographer was paid $195,000 over a 9-month period to do nothing other than take pictures of food. And so he took pictures of food at the Safari Restaurant in Minneapolis and the other half dozen locations that this group was operating, allegedly, around the state. And it would just be 10-second Snapchat videos of trays of food or platters of food that were supposedly being distributed to children.
Were children in the videos?
No, children are never in the videos. And when asked about that, it was, there was shifting explanations. Well, first of all, privacy concerns. We don't want to show children on camera for safety and privacy reasons. And then another explanation came out. Well, again, it was COVID. You couldn't eat inside a restaurant because everybody remembers restaurants were closed for everything but takeout only or delivery only. So they said, no. People were driving up in their automobiles and we were putting in sacks of groceries or trays of prepared foods into the backseat of their cars, and they would drive away. So it was only parents. A child never accompanied any parent on any of these trips to the distribution sites. And it would just be a parent or a neighbor or whoever was picking up the food on that occasion. So that's why you never see any pictures of children in any of these videos. But speaking of videos, the FBI put up poll cameras around Safari Restaurant and these other locations, 24/7 coverage of these sites. And there was not only were there no children, there were rarely any people coming to pick up meals. So it was kind of funny. They would say, "Oh yeah, your video is just of the front door. No, no, our operation was out the back door." Sure enough, the FBI had a camera on the back door, and there were no cars there either.
So that is Said and the Safari Restaurant group. Let's move on to Aimee Bock and Feeding Our Future. Now, you've already said, Bill, that one of the ways that she made money, that nonprofit made money, is they got a 10 or 15% cut of all these hundreds of millions of dollars that went through. Obviously, a huge amount of money. Plus, they also set up one or more sites themselves. Did these turn out to be fraudulent?
Yes. The short answer is yes. Again, there may have been at some of these locations some amount of food. I don't think they were ever prepared there, but might have been distributed out there as a hub. But again, they had the same cameras at her proprietary locations they had at Saeed's restaurant and his business partners' distribution sites. And I visited several of them kind of ex post after the scam was, and they're wholly unsuited to that purpose. They're retail sites or office space located in a place that has no adequate parking or no loading docks for bringing in food or distributing food. And in fact, I don't know if we're going to get to this. One of the bribery charges that she was convicted on was for accepting from the Safari group of investors $310,000 for the sale of an alleged child care. So she had incorporated a company that was supposed to become eventually a child care facility. She had actually signed a lease for some commercial space at a strip mall in Burnsville. She claims to have applied for a license but never received a license. There were no clients. She hadn't recruited any families and any children. It never operated, but she sold the child care facility to these other fraudsters for $310,000. That space, that commercial space she was renting in Burnsville, was supposed to have been a food site run by Aimee Bock herself. And what essentially the sale involved was the sale of that fake food distribution site from Aimee Bock to these other co-conspirators.
And so that was construed as a bribe?
That was construed, not only construed as a bribe, she was convicted on that count. So, yeah. But that was properly interpreted as a reward for her assistance in helping these folks steal money. In fact, that's one of the oddities of the case. She is accused and been convicted of stealing almost $2 million out of the food and putting in her own pocket. And among her cohort of defendants, that was the least amount stolen. So to you or I, $2 million is a lot of money. But in the context of her and her co-conspirators, she profited the least from that group when she was in a position to profit the most.
Interesting.
So she used as evidence of her innocence her relative lack of greed.
Yeah, right. Only $2 million. There's also a story about her boyfriend, the misnamed Empress, somebody or other.
Well, right? His legal government name is Empress Malcolm Watson Jr. I've got the impression that more often than not he goes by Malcolm. But his father is actually named Empress Malcolm Watson Sr., and he plays a cameo role in this as well. But it's interesting, as soon as the FBI raid occurred, and perhaps this was building before then, the two had a falling out. Empress was her live-in boyfriend at their shared home in Rosemount. And then once the FBI raids occurred, he left along with the Mercedes SUV she had bought for him and moved away. But it's interesting, every time his name came up or she brought up his name on the stand as a witness, she referred to him as Empress. But every time they showed a text message between the two of them, the name on the screen popped up Malcolm.
So how does he figure? What was going on there?
Yes, well, he was the live-in boyfriend and had been for several years I understood, prior to the beginning of COVID. So when COVID hit, that's when the fraud really began, or really began in earnest. And he was the live-in boyfriend, and he's a handyman by profession. He began a company called Handy Helpers, and she hired him and his firm as a contractor to do what turned out to be $1 million worth of renovation in her rented office space, the Feeding Our Future office space up in St. Anthony. So, of the $2 million that she's alleged to have profited personally from the scam, $1 million of it was funneled through Malcolm, Empress Malcolm Watson Jr., either through, he was on salary at Feeding Our Future, got about 100 grand out in salary, and then his Handy Helpers renovation company was paid $900,000 for drywall work at the headquarters building.
It's a lot of drywall. Paid by Aimee Bock or by Feeding
Paid
Our
by the corporate entity Feeding Our Future. And it's very interesting, and we'll probably get to it. The board of directors, fake or real, of Feeding Our Future played an important role in her conviction. She had claimed to the media at one point early in the scandal, when this came up, about how her boyfriend had personally profited from all of this renovation. Oh, no, no, he did great work, and it was worth every penny, and cheap at half the price, or cheap at twice the price. She claimed that her board of directors had approved this contract, contract between the corporate entity Feeding Our Future, of which she was the president, and the firm her boyfriend owned. I think she was also on the list of owners of it. And she claims she recused herself from that decision, and with the board approved it in her absence. And it turns out that wasn't true, and there actually wasn't a board.
Yeah, this is a wonderful part of the story. Tell that story. This all came out of trial, right?
It came out of the trial, and they had as three witnesses for the prosecution the three members of the board, other than Aimee Bock herself, for much of the time period involved here. Two of them turned out to be bartenders bartending at restaurant bars on 7th Street in St. Paul. And the third turned out to be, he works for, I forgot, a city or county government, repairing small engines, lawnmowers, leaf blowers, for a Parks and Rec department. So these guys, and I wasn't there for their testimony, but they were reported to be very charismatic blue collar guys. They
basically guys that she knew because she'd go to their bar.
Right. She knew them in passing. She had met the two bartenders by her and Malcolm being patrons, met them as customers. And then the guy who worked for the Parks and Rec department, she met him at a backyard barbecue. And they have all testified, they found out that they were members of this corporate board because a reporter for the New York Times had flown to Minneapolis to cover this story in its early days, and had knocked on their doors to ask them questions about their roles on the board. And this was news to them. So kind of interesting that they found out about their board membership through a reporter. And that reporter wasn't from a local outlet. He was from the New York Times, who flew into town to report this story. But apparently they were very believable, very charismatic, openly admitting they were never members of this board. They really weren't suited to the role of being a president or a secretary or treasury of a corporate board of a $200 million a year operation.
And they testified, I believe, that the board never met.
The board never met, despite the existence of board minutes with their signatures on it, which they said, that's not my signature. And interestingly enough, Aimee Bock, testifying under oath, and agreed those weren't their signatures. She was asked, did you sign their names? She said, I did not. He said, well, they said they didn't sign their names. Are they lying? Well, I'm not saying they're lying. But the mystery of who signed the names of these bartenders and mechanic to the minutes of these non-existent board meetings remains a mystery to this day.
So both Mr. Said and Aimee Bock testified in their own defense, having witnessed these latter stages of the trial. Why do you think they did that?
Narcissism, hubris. Again, Aimee Bock, you've been a lawyer for decades. You would tell your clients who are under indictment or under investigation, don't talk to the press. But she did. She had legal representation from day one, and she did a big series of interviews with basically anybody who would listen to her story. And of course, the story she told the media back in 2022 is very different than the story she was spinning on the stand in 2025. But her lawyer, who claimed he told her not to testify, also told the media that she really, really wants to tell her story. And it might have just been a Hail Mary pass, that they
Nothing to
figured
lose.
there's nothing to lose by testifying except 3 days of your time. I don't think it changed the outcome, but maybe they thought they could appeal, throw themselves on the mercy of the court, and achieve an acquittal, or at least an acquittal on some of the charges.
So how did they fare? They testified. They told their stories. How did they do?
Guilty on all charges. All 28 charges came back guilty, unanimous verdicts from the jury. So, yeah, I don't know if it hurt them, but it certainly didn't help them to testify in person.
But the evidence, it sounds, Bill, like the evidence, the documentary evidence was just overwhelmed.
Right, right. And again, both witnesses tried to come up with explanations, explain away the existence of this documentary evidence. And it was mostly of, I was just following orders or just following advice. Aimee Bock, her defense mostly centered around she trusted her employees, that she signed this document or she submitted these meal counts or these site applications on based on the representations made to her by her staff, people she had hired, people she had trusted, who turns out to have betrayed her trust. But
So fraud was committed, but not by her.
right, she fully admits now she admits that fraud was committed and they fooled her. She's the real victim in this, in that, or the first victim in this, and that these people who worked for her or worked with her committed the fraud, and somehow it escaped her attention, and she did all these things like sign the checks and submit the claim forms, trusting people who, in hindsight, she shouldn't have trusted.
So this scandal is conventionally referred to as the Feeding Our Future scandal, after the name of that nonprofit founded by Aimee Bock. But they were not the only sponsor, not the only
No.
major sponsor of sites that supposedly were feeding a lot of children. And there's another one called what, Partners in Nutrition, I think.
Right, right. So there were actually the three biggest sponsors, intermediaries in the program during calendar year 2021, which was the big year of the fraud. It's interesting that it just kept ramping up and ramping up. You would think once kids started going back to school, once COVID's restrictions started lessening, restaurants started opening, the demand for the free food would have lessened, but it was ramping up right to the very end. And the Department of Education, I hate to give them any credit, but to their credit, they didn't just shut down Feeding Our Future. They shut down the two other largest food distribution sponsors. Partners in Nutrition just edged out by Feeding Our Future for that number one spot. Partners in Nutrition, a close second, over $200 million of food. And the third one was called Youth Leadership Academy, who did business as Gargar Family Services. They were also shut down by the Department of Education. Interestingly enough, those other two, Partners in Nutrition, Youth Leadership Academy, their names kept coming up over and over in the trial from witnesses, both for the prosecution and defense. Nobody from any of those other two organizations has ever been indicted with or charged with any wrongdoing
How
in the
about their
case.
site? So their site's been indicted?
No, nobody who, I guess the answer is yes, because some of the people convicted in the first trial had sites with Partners in Nutrition. So some of their vendors, if you will, were convicted in courtroom settings or have pled guilty in trial in cases that haven't gone to trial, but nobody from the sponsors, the top corporation.
Oh, this is another interesting aspect of this story, though, Bill, that I think the general public is probably not aware of, and that is that there's a relationship between Aimee Bock and this other nonprofit, Partners in Nutrition.
Yeah, so Aimee Bock and the woman who ran Partners in Nutrition were the co-founders of Partners in Nutrition. And that got going, I think, back in 2017. In 2018, there was a falling out between who had been best friends.
Pre-COVID, Partners in Nutrition.
Pre-COVID, yeah. These entities were around before COVID, and they were much smaller operations, serving a few $100,000, a couple of $1 million, mostly daycares. And these women went into business together with Partners in Nutrition. They had a falling out after about a year working together. Aimee Bock founded Feeding Our Future, and competed with Partners in Nutrition for market share among daycares and other sites that were legitimate sites distributing food. And this continued right up to the end, this battle between the two of them. And Gargar Family Services, a Youth Leadership Academy, started out as a distribution site under both Partners in Nutrition and Feeding Our Future, then spun off to create their own network. And they were later shut down. So all these three were interlocking. They all competed for market share. All were shut down. And in the case of Youth Leadership Academy, their owners were banned from participating in food programs. But nobody was charged in any of those other groups.
So these two women, Aimee Bock and the woman who wound up running Partners in Nutrition, started out as partners,
best friends and partners,
and had a falling out, and they became competitors and bitter enemies,
the bitterest of enemies.
And so this is something I'm not sure has ever been made public before, but somewhere along the way here, we started getting fat envelopes delivered to our office, our American Experiment office, and I think they had your name on them. Attention.
Right. They were mailed to me, which is a little scary when you get mail at the office with no return address and stamps on there, and you feel like you need to, call 911. But they were just stacks of paper. They were just stacks of paper, and the documents were assembled obviously from the standpoint of somebody within Feeding Our Future, because they showed this market share battle between these three nonprofit networks, and the documents were, if you read them together, they're very accusatory of the role, the incompetence of Department of Education, and the ongoing, unethical behavior of Partners in Nutrition. But again, it's been made very clear that this $250 million estimate for the scandal is just what Feeding Our Future took out of the programs. If you add together what these other two networks, Partners in Nutrition and Youth Leadership Academy, took out of the food programs, you get above $500 million. In fact, if you just look at calendar year 2021, the entire program, which includes schools and daycares and all kinds of other YMCAs and all kinds of other people, hundreds of providers, those three nonprofits took out something more than 2/3, almost 70% of every dollar in the program. So for this 1 year, almost the whole thing was a scam.
So where do we go from here? You've already indicated there's a couple of sponsors that haven't been charged. There's another 250 million plus that apparently hasn't been charged. Are there going to be more charges brought, do you think? More people pleading guilty, more trials? What do you think is going to happen?
Right. Again, I can't speak for the U.S. attorney, so I don't know if these other networks will ever be charged with anything. But
why wouldn't they be?
I don't know. You have to ask them. So again, I'm not a lawyer, and I'm super careful not to accuse somebody of fraud who isn't guilty of the federal code's definition of the crime, which has 4 elements, which we all heard about at the trial. So maybe it was one of the elements is somehow missing for those two networks. But the U.S. attorney, I attended the press conference they held after the verdicts were read last week, and the acting U.S. attorney and the lead prosecutor, Joe Thompson, were both asked this question. And the answer, they were asked it twice, and the answer both times seemed to be, you should expect to see more indictments in the case, that the investigation continues, is ongoing, and they don't think they're done with it yet. So that's what's more to come. Perhaps more indictments in the case, but we're going to have more trials. So there are trials. It's like airplanes stacked up trying to land. There are trials scheduled beginning next month and then scheduled through the end of 2025 for these other couple of dozen or so defendants that haven't been either convicted or found innocent, found guilty, haven't been processed.
Yeah, I'm guessing more guilty pleas to come. Bill, before we move on, the last thing I want to talk about, one thing we haven't mentioned is one aspect of the trial that got some publicity in the newspapers. In the first trial, there was an attempt made to bribe the juror by leaving at her house a bag full of cash, $120,000 or some such amount. In the second trial that's now been concluded, there was also there was an attempt not to bribe a juror, but apparently to intimidate a witness.
Yes, so it's interesting that trial takes place on the 13th floor of the federal building in downtown Minneapolis, and there was going to be, and it ended up testifying. There was going to be a prosecution witness testifying in this current case, who happened to be one of the defendants. So this defendant pled guilty. He's already entered his guilty plea, hasn't been sentenced yet, but part of his deal was, be a cooperating witness. And so he was about to testify, and he was staying in the hallway, waiting to be called into the room as a witness, when he was approached by another defendant in the case who also wasn't on trial in the current trial, but who was awaiting trial. Is supposed to have been, I can't remember when he was supposed to have gone on trial, sometime in 2025. He wasn't on trial. He approached this witness and invited the cooperating witness to join him in the restroom a few feet away to discuss the finer points of the case. Well, as it turned out, our witness defendant declined the offer, told his lawyer, and then the witness's lawyer told the prosecutor. The prosecutor then told the judge. And then the judge issued, I don't know, it was a writ or a warrant to bring this guy in for questioning about this alleged attempt at witness tampering. But the guy who was allegedly the tamperer, a defendant in the case, while the case was going on, he threw in the towel and he pled guilty to the fraud, and as part of his fraud guilty plea, admitted to the witness tampering.
So the last area I want to cover with you, Bill, is basically, what's the takeaway as citizens and as taxpayers? What lessons should we be drawing from this?
Well, again, I'm always reluctant to credit the federal government with anything, much less high levels of competence and really truly looking out for the public interest. So kudos to the U.S. Department of Justice and everybody who's been involved in the prosecution of these cases. On the other hand, we have the State Department of Education, where sitting in the back of the room watching the trial unfold, we heard from witness after witness of the staggering incompetence of the State Department of Education. In fact, that was one of the defenses put forward by Aimee Bock, was that don't blame me, you should blame the Department of Education.
They're so incompetent. It was like taking
candy. They approved the site applications. They approved the meal count invoices. They sent out the money, and there's something to that. In my view, she sat on the stand and lied for 3 days straight. But there was one thing she said that had the ring of truth to it, that the Department of Education has a lot to answer for, and they haven't. And so, as a takeaway, as a taxpayer, as a person who's here in Minnesota, you're going, where were they? Well, they knew who the fraudsters were from day one, because we found out all these Safari Restaurant and all these other people who would later be indicted and convicted in the case had applied to join the food program. And the Department of Education's initial take was no, and they denied their applications. But then later they admitted them and then tried to throw them out. They relented, then they cut off the money. They wouldn't pay their invoices. Then they relented and started paying their invoices away. So you see at least 3 junctures where the Department of Education could have stopped this from ever happening, could have stopped this fraud at $50 million, could have stopped this fraud at $100 million, but they didn't. They didn't stop the fraud until the FBI raids, by which point $250 million had gone out the door to Feeding Our Future, $500 million to the other people they ended up throwing out of the program.
And this fraud, this feeding the children fraud, is not the only one. You here at American Experiment have developed for our website something called the Scandal Tracker.
Right. And then again, this was inspired. I want to give them credit. online website, news site, Minnesota Reformer did some digging early on in the Feeding Our Future case and discovered that about half of the defendants in the Feeding Our Future case had other businesses that were taking money out of other government programs. In fact, one of the defendants in the Feeding Our Future case, and this came out at the trial last week, had already been indicted by the federal court in Minnesota on a Medicaid fraud deal involving a bogus translation business, providing translation services. She was under indictment by the federal court in a Medicaid fraud while participating in the food program, while getting millions of dollars out of the State Department of Education, while she's being indicted for defrauding the State Department of Human Services. So I started digging into fraud cases and looking for some of these cross-pollination, if you will, and came up, it's up to now $611 million of cases I've documented of fraud against state government by organizations defrauding, and it's education, human services, employment, economic development, Department of Health, Department of Labor. There's some 27 different state agencies that give out these grants to private entities, nonprofits, for-profits, and they've been defrauded one after the other. $611 million.
So basically, corruption in Minnesota, it's not limited to this particular scandal. This is one of 27 that you've identified. Are these all during the Walz administration?
Yeah, this is because we, oddly enough, had a previous scandal tracker that covered scandals during the Dayton administration, and it hadn't been updated since then. So I started a new tracker and started it with the handover to administrations and created a new scandal tracker, and that's all since he took office.
So 27 scandals, $611 million, and I'm sure that is an undercount. Well, let's do this, Bill. I think that sums up the current state of the Feeding Our Future scandal and the trial and so on very well. Let's go to questions now for the remainder of the hour, and let's do it on a kind of a blitz basis and see how many we can get through. I'm not sure how many we've got, but I'm sure we won't get to all of them. Here's a question that we hear a lot. How much of the money that was stolen has been or will be recovered out of that 250 million?
Yeah, that's the number one question that we get is, and the answer, this was asked at the press conference the U.S. attorney held after the verdict last week, and his answer was $60 million. And that was Joe Thompson. And every time I've heard Joe Thompson give an answer, or at least lately, that's the answer I've heard numbers as high as 66 million. And again, almost all of that was captured in that same time frame as the FBI raids. It was interesting. We heard in testimony in this last trial that, and I don't want to name the bank because you've all heard of it, but one of the banks where they'd asked banking records from inadvertently tipped off one of the subjects of the investigation by freezing their bank account a few hours before the raid occurred. But the Department of Justice, the FBI, went and froze and seized all the not all of them, but many of the personal bank accounts of their people they were investigating, and basically all the corporate accounts of these entities, Feeding Our Future, a lot of the corporate entities of these vendors. And then they've seized homes and cars, commercial office buildings, pieces of land, jewelry, personal belongings, cash when they raided these homes, and vehicles. Some of them had stacks of cash.
So it sounds like they've gotten back about 25 cents on the dollar, which is the most you can ever expect.
Well, again, a lot of the
inevitably, most of the money is going to be gone.
A lot of the money went overseas. It was sent abroad. They're not going to get that money back. Commercial and residential properties in Asia, in Africa, China, whatever reason, got money. Cryptocurrency got money. They're not getting that back either. And then, like the cars, these were all brand new cars when these fraudsters bought them.
And they weren't Ford Escorts, I'm sure.
No, they had, I don't know, good taste, but they were expensive. But these cars that they were purchased, they've all depreciated. They're all used vehicles now. You know, the commercial office market isn't what it was pre-COVID. So some of these buildings, they bought an abandoned restaurant in Brooklyn Park, and they're getting cents on the dollar for that.
Here's another one. Is there any evidence that, and this is another one that you hear a lot, is there any evidence that these multiple frauds were intentionally orchestrated by state elected political officials?
I'll say no, and I'll expand it to appointed officials as
Right.
well. I have seen personally no evidence that anybody elected or appointed to public office at the state level is complicit in that they're co-conspirators. But you've asked me this question before, and my answer was has always been at some level gross incompetence is indistinguishable from active sabotage. So when you let $250 million or $500 million walk out the door on your watch, maybe you weren't a conspirator, but what responsibility do you have for the outcome?
You're an enabler, perhaps we could say.
Yeah, but no evidence that anybody personally profited from this. Now, almost every elected official was getting campaign contributions from these folks, and in some cases, fairly substantial campaign contributions. But there's no evidence that, and again, a lot of these politicians, the mayor of Minneapolis, local state reps, state senators, city council people, went to bat for feeding our future. And their vendors, but there's no evidence there was a quid pro quo. Oh, we gave you these campaign donations so you would do this service on our behalf. They did the service on their behalf, they say, because these were constituents who brought to us a problem. State government was not being responsive. I mentioned they actually shut the money off for some time.
Here's one. Is Aimee smart enough to lead this, or is she a plant for other nefarious operators to feed more money to Somalian community? And can we expect this money may somehow arm a paramilitary group? Well, I didn't read this one all the way through, obviously, but let's just cut it off with the first half of that question. And it's not an unreasonable question, at least up to that point. I mean, is Aimee Bock really up to this, or do you think there was anybody else behind her?
She is up to it. And we saw the evidence that she set up this company. Again, $200 million a year flowing through this company. She was the only person with authorization to sign on the bank account. She personally signed every paper check that went out the door. She was the only person enabled within her company. And she claimed at one time to have had up to 100 employees on staff, but she was the only person who could physically enter in meal counts or invoices into the Department of Education system. So she set herself up as the hub of this. And so I got to figure that was deliberate. You know, I've been a controller, you've been a business executive. You get more than one person signed on the bank account. You have more than one person looking over somebody's shoulder in transactions, counter signatures, or other authorizations. So it all seemed to be set up deliberately for her to enable industrial scale fraud.
Another question here. Is there an ongoing investigation into daycare center fraud perpetrated somewhat in the same manner?
Yes, and I would expand that not just to daycare center fraud, but autism clinic fraud, adult daycare fraud. We know of active federal investigations of those last two items and active state investigations being conducted. The department, again, another guy I usually reluctant to give credit to, Keith Ellison has, and he didn't come up with this idea, but he has within his office a small but very effective Medicaid fraud investigative unit. And you mentioned the 27 items in my scandal tracker. By number, most of them came out of that office. And so they've been looking into this child care fraud. There have been over the years convictions of people stealing money from that program. Jay Coles of KSTP has done some wonderful investigative work at a media outlet of that. But there are active criminal investigations continuing into that child care assistance program.
Here's a question about the evidence in the case. Was the fact that very little of the stolen money was spent on ingredients for the alleged meals, or food for the alleged meals, was that the key to this trial, or was it something else? Well, in some sense, it certainly was the key.
Oh,
to
yes.
the trial.
Oh, for sure. And Joe Thompson, the lead prosecutor, gave credit to the forensic accountant employed by the FBI for breaking the case open, that she brought to Joe all these bank records and financial records where she had gone through the books of these entities and calculated ranging from 0 to about 5% of their gross revenue was spent on buying food. So, if you look at a regular commercial restaurant, it's about 20, 25% spent on food. You got to hire cooks and waiters and pay your rent and your electric bill and all that stuff. But so little money was spent by these entities who were supposedly in the exclusive business of handing out food. That was the original red flag, at least on the federal side, that this wasn't on the up and up.
Another viewer asks, would you please comment on Willie Jett's appearance? And Willie Jett is the current Commissioner of Education, right? Appearance before the House Fraud Committee, and also on the timing of the resignation of his two predecessors.
Yeah. And again, you can find a sinister answer to these questions. You can find a benign answer to these questions. I've worked for the last Republican governor, and I'm very familiar with the phenomenon of, even though the governor gets reelected, a lot of his top people don't stick around for the second term. The new people come in. That being said, I saw Willie Jett in person. I saw his appearance before. It's a joint House-Senate committee on audit. The legislative auditor, she presented her report on the Minnesota Department of Education's oversight or lack thereof of the nonprofit Feeding Our Future. Willie Jett appeared on behalf of the Department of Education, basically wouldn't answer any questions. He would say, well, that was my predecessor, that he appeared with his general counsel, and she was new to that post, and they couldn't speak for what their predecessors have done. They couldn't really speak to anything of that because they didn't want to endanger or hinder the ongoing federal investigation. So it was an amazing appearance and how little information was transmitted by the guy for whom the buck is supposed to stop.
Here's a question, and a lot of our viewers, I've been going through the questions here, and there a lot of the questions are being asked more than once in a little bit different form. But there's obviously a high level of concern about politicians in Minnesota, whether they had a role or how they related to this. And I'll just read this question and get your thoughts on it. What about the politicians that have been linked to Feeding Our Future? Fateh, if I'm saying that right, Ilhan Omar, and Jamal Osman. Osman's wife's organization was shut down by Ellison as being a shell company whose sole purpose was to enrich her family. They also sold that entity to Said. The guy just got convicted in the second trial. Thoughts on that?
Right. All of that was correct. Just one little nuance. They're two different corporate entities. So Jamal Osman sold a nonprofit that he had created pre-COVID. I don't know to what extent it was operational pre-COVID, but he sold that corporate entity to a group of people who later turned out to be convicted in the Feeding Our Future fraud, using that nonprofit corporate entity to further the conspiracy. Osman's wife, she started another nonprofit that was enrolled in the food distribution network, different food distribution network, received close to $500,000 in reimbursement for meals she allegedly served to children. She was sued civilly by Keith Ellison in the Attorney General's office to dissolve that second corporate entity. You read his lawsuit against her nonprofit, it was pretty clear that Keith Ellison's lawyers thought it was all a scam. The judge, they reached a settlement that the company was dissolved. Again, that being said, even though both names came up during both of these trials in federal court, neither Osman nor his wife have been charged with any wrongdoing on a criminal basis at any level, state or federal. But her nonprofit was sued civilly and forced to shut down.
So we always like to end these webinars in a timely fashion. So why don't we wrap up with two related questions? One question is, when will the sentencing of these two now convicted defendants take place? And the second is, how much jail time do they potentially face?
Well, it's a process after the conviction. I'm used to watching all those Hollywood movies where the jury verdict and the sentence all get pronounced from the bench.
The gavel.
Yeah. That's not how it works, at least not in federal court. So there's an entire process where I forgot what it's called, probation services prepares a report, and they prepare a sentencing recommendation that the judge may or may not accept, or usually used as a starting point. It'll take several months to process that, and then then we'll see. Based on, there have only been, of the 45 convictions in the case so far, only 3 defendants have actually received sentences. And the longest sentence received so far was by a defendant named Mukhtar Sharif, and he received 17 and a half years in federal prison. So that's the most received by
Well, that's
any
a good
defendant.
long sentence.
That's a long sentence. And from my viewpoint, my opinion, he was much less culpable than either of these defendants who were convicted last week. So my money, my starting point would be, I would expect something north of 20 years.
So Judge Brossel, we haven't talked about her. We talked a little bit about the jury and the lawyers and whatnot. Didn't really talk about her. She is presiding over all these Feeding Our Future cases, right?
Yes, she presides over all the fates of all 70 defendants. She was the presiding judge in both cases. Every now and again, there's some conflicts, and somebody has to sit in for her, but she's been there 99% of the time, and again has acquitted herself ably.
Yeah, I get the feeling that she does not have a lot of patience for these frauds.
Oh, less and less
for
all the
these-
time.
for these defendants. Is that fair?
I think so. I think so. And again, I think the turning point was the bribery attempt. That she took that personally. That was an affront to her court, because she's very protective of her jurors. They work for the court. They work for the judicial branch. They don't work for the prosecution. They don't work for the defense. And that somebody sitting in front of her would go as far to tamper with that process. Again, maybe she wouldn't agree with my view of it, but I think she was taking that personally.
Well, thank you, Bill Glahn, for being here today. We'll see. This might be the last of our Feeding Our Future webinars. I don't know.
Somehow, I don't think so.
But if all of a sudden Partners in Nutrition crops up and there's a whole bunch of new indictments, we'll probably be back again. In any event, though, that's all for today. And thanks to all who attended.